basically the rich countries of the West became very rich, where the GDP per capita was up 21 times. And the poor countries of the world, the GDP per capita in real terms was up only 2.5 times, partly also because they had strong population growth. Basically, I think that this feature, how the West grew rich, is now over for good, and that from here onwards, emerging economies will have faster growth rates in the long run. Now, it doesn't mean that the US economy will totally collapse and that Western Europe will go into oblivion, but I'm just maintaining that to increase the standards of living in Western Europe and in the US in real terms will be very difficult from here onwards, whereas, say, in China and in India and in Vietnam and also in Central Asia or in Eastern Europe, the per capita increases in GDP will outperform the ones in the Western world. So the strong economic growth is more likely to be in these less developed countries, the emerging markets, than in the developed countries on a permanent basis. The US current account deficit led to a worsening of the financial position of the US. You can see here the net asset balance turned negative in '87. By the way, the year Mr. Greenspan became Fed chairman, but it wasn't his fault. It was the expansionary fiscal policies pursued before. And then it stabilized the net asset balance here at around 5% of GDP. And then here, 2001, ultra-expansionary monetary policies, the current account deficit blows out, the net asset balance deteriorates very badly. Now, some people have said, don't worry about the current account deficit, it's a sign of economic health. But what it led is to this terrific underperformance of US assets vis-à-vis foreign assets in the period 2002 to 2007. But now, as you can see, because the current account deficit is no longer expanding, I think this relative tightening of global liquidity is relatively favorable for US assets, at least for the next, say, 6 months or so, and that the dollar can actually appreciate somewhat more. Obviously, this in the long run is not sustainable. Something will give. And if the US didn't enjoy the status of a reserve currency, let's say if the US was Indonesia or Brazil, the whole system would have collapsed with this kind of current account deficit. It's only because the US dollar has one advantage. It has US dollar debts, but it also has US dollar assets. In other words, there's no mismatch of liabilities and assets, whereas Indonesia, if they have a current account deficit, they have to borrow in foreign currencies. So they have a foreign currency liabilities and assets in local currencies, and when the current account deficit goes up, the currency collapses and the debt level becomes unbearable. So that was an advantage the US enjoyed, but they may not enjoy it forever. In particular, I think that long-term the US dollar will obviously be a weak currency. As I said, the Federal Reserve has no other option but to print money, and Mr. Bernanke is a money printer. You have to believe me, that is very clear. 2, there is a transfer of wealth occurring from the United States and also to some extent from Western Europe to emerging economies, and that is a permanent feature. Eventually, the weak dollar, and as I said, in the near term, the US dollar could strengthen somewhat, but eventually it will lead to higher import price inflation and inflationary pressures in the system. The US could actually stabilize its problems by keeping money tight. It would create near-term some, let's say, discomfort, further discomfort in the asset markets, but it would strengthen the dollar and it would lead to a rising savings rate, which would be desirable because the basic problem of US economic policies and of the US economy is that it consumes too much and it doesn't invest enough. Countries become rich by high capital spending, whether that is capital spending for research and development or to build the infrastructure or to build capacity expansion in industries. If you don't do that, you end up with car companies like you have in the United States that produce essentially dinosaurs that nobody can use. The only vehicle that had a moderate success is the most useless vehicle ever invented, the Hummer. But luckily they closed that down now. It will have some value as a collectible. Essentially, in the long run, I suppose the US dollar will be devalued substantially, but of course, against what? As I said, for now, the US dollar is likely to appreciate. I suppose the depreciation over time will be against the Chinese currency, which depreciated here between 1981 to 94 by 80%. Here, 2005, it begins to appreciate. I think this appreciation could last for many years to come. Also, I suppose, and I'll talk about this later, that the US dollar and other currencies will continue to depreciate against precious metals, whose supply cannot be increased at the same rate as the money supply. In the US, in Asia, what may cushion the downturn in the economy somewhat. I mean, I think they're, like Thailand is already in recession and others are also, Singapore is in recession. But in the long run, what may cushion the recession somewhat is the urbanization. You can see here in China, urbanization has gone from 26% in 1996 to over 40%. In other words, 20 million people move to the cities every year. And obviously that necessitates construction of new buildings, the infrastructure and so forth. So that should support some economic growth. In India, urbanization is just 30%. 70% live in the countryside, 700 million people. By the way, about 40% of Indian population doesn't know how to read and write. But that should, in the long run, this urbanization trend support the real estate markets and economic growth. We also have in Asia very low level of mortgage debt compared to the Western world. Like also Turkey, they didn't have a mortgage market until 2 years ago. Now it's gradually developing, so that increases the affordability of households to buy a home. Then we also have favorable demographics in all the Asian countries except Japan, and China will still have favorable demographics until, say, 2025. After that, it will also deteriorate, but it's not deteriorating as badly as in the US. Now, some people say we had a real estate bubble in China, and that may be true for some cities and some regions of the country. But if you look at Chinese economic growth, you had in the last few years 10% real growth. Then you had, say, 10% inflation, so nominal GDP increased by 20%. But home prices nationwide, across the board, they didn't go up by 20%. So as a percent of the economy, home prices went down. They also went down as a percent of incomes, of household incomes. Where the real bubble is really in Anglo-Saxon countries, because here in Asia, you have real estate prices. They're no higher than they were in 97. Admittedly, in 97, we had a bubble in real estate in Asia. But basically, real estate prices in most Asian countries are quite reasonable compared to, say, real estate prices here in the Anglo-Saxon countries. They've gone into cuckoo land, in England, in Ireland, in Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. So relative to the Western world, I think we don't have a huge problem in housing in Asia. Also, you have to understand